think about exerting anything like jogging, running, the heart needs more blood and hence more oxygen in order to function properly, right?
Yes.
You also described the fight or flight kind of the physiology of that in your consideration, right?
Yes, the physiological stress. Mm-hmm.
And the physiological stress produces adrenaline, right?
Yes.
And that also causes the heart to work harder
Yes.
and therefore need more blood
Yes.
and more oxygen.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. In this particular case, right, we have a heart that is at least above average, right, needing more blood. We have a heart with a occluded right coronary artery, right? Narrowed.
Mm-hmm.
We have a heart that the left anterior descending artery also had a 75% narrowing, right?
Yes.
And so you have, and then you have an exertion of stress producing adrenaline, right?
Yes.
So the heart has to work very, very hard in this case. Fair to
Yes.
say? Let's take the police out of this, and I'm going to ask you a hypothetical. Let's assume you found Mr. Floyd dead in his residence. No police involvement, no drugs, right? The only thing you found would be these facts about his heart. What would you conclude to be the cause of death?
In that very narrow set of circumstances, I would probably conclude that the cause of death was his heart disease.
So have you, as a forensic pathologist, ever certified a death due to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
Probably thousands of times, yes.
With similar degrees of narrowing of the arteries?
Yes.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiomegaly? I'm trying to...
Yes, hypertensive cardiovascular disease, yes, absolutely.
With a heart at this weight or even smaller?
Well, if it was, again, in this setting where that was the only abnormal finding, then I would probably go with that, yes.
So one of the things that has to be considered in this particular case is Mr. Floyd's heart, right?
Yes.
And even without any sort of an exertion, again, take the exertion out of it, take the police out of it, take the drugs out of it, that's a potential cause of death that needs to be considered.
Yes.
You discussed the abrasions that you saw and the jury saw pictures of. You would agree that the abrasions are in a left to right pattern?
Meaning there are more on the left than on the right?
Right.
On his face, yes. On his shoulder, yes. And then he had the abrasions on his right hand.
And even in terms of the pattern of the abrasion, there's up and down an abrasion could go from the bottom of my body up, or it could go from left to right, right?
Yes. I guess I didn't really focus on what direction the abrasions were going in that sense.
Okay, and that's fine. But you would agree that one possible way that at least some of these abrasions occurred would be when Mr. Floyd was initially put down on the ground.
I guess they could, yes.
Right. And not all of those abrasions necessarily occurred while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, right?
That's hard to answer,
Right.
I would say.
It's hard to answer when the abrasions were there and
Right.
what caused the abrasions, right?
Right.
And if someone was being held down with the weight of 3 people, would you expect those to be more punctile in their nature or or like with the lines and movements?
Oh, gosh, there are too many variables there, I would say.
Okay. Now, you ultimately determined that this case was an asphyxiation, essentially, right?
Yes, that was the primary mechanism.
Right. And asphyxiation is simply the lack of oxygen to the brain?
Yeah, low oxygen, inadequate oxygen.
Inadequate oxygen to the brain specifically.
Yes.
And in terms of asphyxiation, you would agree that there are multiple things that can cause asphyxiation.
Yes.
So you use the reference to someone being strangled, right?
Yes.
So if I came up to you and I strangled, or I strangled a person, put my hands around their neck, there are certain things that you would expect to see, right?
Sometimes you do, yes. And that's great when you do. You don't always, but
And those would be things like a broken hyoid bone,
yeah.
right? The petechial hemorrhaging that you discussed.
Yes.
And in an asphyxia death, there are oftentimes, frequently, those types of signs available, right?
Well, it really depends on the mechanism of asphyxia.
Okay, so let's go back to the mechanisms of asphyxia. You described it. Strangling would be one.
Yeah.
Hanging could be one.
Yes.
Right. You've described positional or mechanical asphyxia.
Those are types, yes.
Yep. Positional being, based on the position of the body. Mechanical being something, using some sort of a device to asphyxiate someone.
Oh, well, we haven't really talked a lot about positional and mechanical. I mean, there's all kinds of things under both of those that can cause low oxygen.
And one of the things that can cause a low oxygen to the brain is the use of controlled substances, correct?
Well, eventually, yes. Yes.
So someone can ingest a particular type of a controlled substance. That particular substance could affect the diaphragm, right?
It affects some controlled substances affect the ability to breathe, which then decreases the oxygen, which then leads to low oxygen, yes.
Right. And that's essentially what you're saying is that there, in this particular case, as I understand it with my notes, is that essentially what happens is there was some event that happened that resulted in a decrease of oxygen to the brain, and that resulted in death.
Yes.
And that's essentially what asphyxia is generally.
Inadequate oxygen, yes.
Right. Okay. And you were asked a series of questions about some studies in terms of, I think they're called they're out of San Diego. Or
Yes, Dr. Chan. And
Dr. Chan's, right. Yep. Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine?
Yes.
Now, you testified that some of the problems with the Chan studies were that they were in laboratory settings. Sorry. Laboratory settings, that they were controlled environments, healthy individuals, etc., right?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Christine Hall and her paper, Incidence and Outcome of Prone Positioning Following Police Use of Force in a Prospective Consecutive Cohort of Subjects?
Is that the one from Canada?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was essentially an analysis of actual police encounters, correct?
Yes, in Canada.
In Canada, understood. But they actually, that study, they go through and they look at the number of police-citizen interactions, correct?
Yes.
And then from those police-citizen interactions, they further go in to look at how many involved being placed in the prone position or a non-prone position, correct?
Yes.
They consider various actual real-life variables, agreed?
Yeah.
And including drugs, whether drugs were on board, whether the length of time to a certain extent that someone was in the prone position, agreed?
Yes.
And ultimately, they analyzed about 3,000 prone positional displacements
Yes.
out of a total of like 1.1 million police interactions.
Yes.
So 1.1 million police interactions resulting in about 3,000 prone position arrests. That those these are real people, real incidents, right?
Yeah.
And in those 3,000 or so interactions, there were no deaths that occurred.
Isn't that amazing? When you consider that virtually every forensic pathologist in the United States has probably had an officer-involved death like this. How did they, it utterly baffles me, which is why I kept saying Canada, because I think, I don't know what's different, but
I'm going to object that this time is non-responsive. So let me ask you, in terms of hypoxia, can you again define hypoxia?
low oxygen.
Right. And which organ is more sensitive to the lack of oxygen? The brain. The brain.
Absolutely.
The brain's the most. It needs the most oxygen, right?
Yes.
And that's because it's doing millions of things simultaneously, right? Agreed?
Yes. I'm sure there's lots of reasons metabolically why it needs oxygen.
Right. I think a previous witness testified that it takes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply to function. Right?
That sounds about right, yes.
But the heart also needs oxygen, right?
Yes.
So in terms of the professional standards for determining an asphyxia death, is it true that you have to first exclude all natural and non-natural cases or causes of death?
Well, you can have natural and non-natural causes of low oxygen. So I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand.
Sure. There's a criteria that's established for making a determination of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, right?
Well, I'm not really sure what, I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Fair enough. Is the prone position in and of itself inherently dangerous?
Not if there are no other factors.
Okay. So the prone position is examined and used in a lot of different settings, right?
Correct.
I mean, even in hospitals, in the treatment of, say, COVID, the prone position is used.
Correct.
And in those circumstances, being in a prone position is not inherently dangerous, right?
Yes.
I mean, chiropractors put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
Massage therapists put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
So the prone position, I'm just talking generally
Right.
speaking, no other factors. The prone position in and of itself is not inherently dangerous, right?
Right.
Is the prone position on concrete